everyone, and thanks for this invitation. I'm really glad to be here for the 10th years anniversary of UNESCO MGIP. I've been here a lot of time, and I've been actually talking to Ananta a lot of time. So I'm trying to be disruptive as he wished me to be. So he gave me some key disruptive point that I need to go through. So I'll try to do that. So I'm going to try to go through basically what COVID has produced on learning as a way to basically emphasize why we need to act fast and why we need to call for more transdisciplinarity in the way we do research, because we tend to do research in silos, like one discipline doing its own thing on education, and we need to be broaden the scope of the type of research we're doing, and I'm also going to make a plea for the fact that we need to have a research agenda that is truly international, because we need to know not only what works, but what works where, and I think this is key now to try to broaden the scope of the research we're doing. Okay, so if you look at the different countries, those are data from OECD, and I'm sorry about that, but it's also UNESCO, so I think I'm fine here. And if you look at the number of days schools were closed during COVID, you see there is a huge heterogeneity. So if you go, the average is basically 100 days, but you have countries that goes all the way to 250 and some that only at school closure for 25 days. So you will increase basically heterogeneity of the type of inequalities and educational inequalities. So we have to bear in mind that we are not all equal in the way this COVID crisis affected our educational system. Well, more worrisome is the fact that actually when you look at the countries who had the least performance in PISA, and I know all the shortcomings of PISA, but it's just a way to look at international comparison between educational system and academic performance, actually countries who had their school closed for the longer of times were the ones who had the least performance in PISA in 2018. So basically, you increase probably the effect on educational achievement. So when we think about how COVID affected basically learning, this crisis hasn't affected learning in the same way in different countries, and apparently it will affect more countries that were already struggling with educational attainment and academic performance. Okay, so I'll always try to show you where the data come from which country, basically. So those are countries from France. It's done by the Ministry of Education, showing basically learning loss both in literacy and numeracy. And you can go through all different types of literacy abilities or competencies, all different kinds of numeracy competencies. If you look post-COVID, there is learning loss across the board. And when you look at all the students aggregated together, basically you show that there is learning loss during school closure or during the COVID times. Okay, but actually it's not the case for all socioeconomic status and for all families. Here is very high SES families who participate in this international studies. One of my colleagues actually was involved in this study, and the lab was also involved. And it's data collected on 8 to 36 months old children who stayed at home during COVID, basically. And what you're looking on the left is basically expressive vocabulary depending of screen exposure. And the good news is that basically during COVID at least, screen exposure had no effect whatsoever on learning gain in vocabulary. So, I mean, there might be issues with screen exposure, but at least for this amount of time, it hasn't affected vocabulary whatsoever in 8 to 36 months old learning gain in vocabulary. If you look on the right side of the screen, irrespective of countries, basically, you find that 15 minutes of parental reading actually increase vocabulary of 8 to 36 months old children, and this is true no matter the country you're looking at. So this is high SES, and if you can look at some of this data, there are families in which actually children benefited from 2 to 3 hours of parental reading per day. I mean, I don't know how is it possible, but we're talking about very high SES people here. So I'm just saying that if you look at SES, if you look across countries, you can find specificities, but you also can find basically commonalities, things that works no matter the context, basically. Okay, so we also know that COVID didn't affect the same way all students. And of course, it has a greater effect on low SES children or children from low SES families. Here is data from Netherlands. They just had, it's cool data because they just basically had national evaluation before the school closed and just after the school just reopened. And what you can see in the middle of the screen is basically you found learning loss in all students, but of course you get more learning loss for low SES children. So again, what this COVID crisis is basically producing on a large scale is increasing educational inequalities. So this is why it's so urgent that we find some leverage, basically, to find ways to reduce educational inequalities. That should be our primary goal at the moment. Okay, why does it produce, basically, why did COVID produce so much learning loss? Well, probably because it affected the brain. And what actually COVID produced wasn't only school closure. It was also basically a period of time where children were exposed to chronic stress. And we know for a long time that actually if you look at the middle of the screen, this is all the neural system in the brain that are affected by chronic stress and basically by socioeconomic status. So if you look at the effect of socioeconomic status on the children's development, all the neural systems that are affected by SES are the one depicted in the middle of this slide. And basically all these systems are the one involved in learning. Those are the one involved in language, the one involved in long-term memory, the one involved in rules learning, and the one involved in emotional reactivity. So when you come from low SES, you do have more difficulty to learn because it affects your brain. There is no other way. You learn with your brain. If you remove the brain, no learning, basically. So if you have social inequalities in learning, it's because it has an effect on the brain. And it has an effect on the brain already 4 months after your birth. So that's the effect of social inequalities on learning. And what probably produced the learning loss during COVID is the effect of all being exposed to chronic stress, because we know that chronic stress will have an effect. If it has an effect because of SES, it's because SES has an effect on your exposure to chronic stress. But of course, we didn't like kind of switch from a biological determinism from a social determinisms, and we heard about neuroplasticity. There are ways to compensate for basically where you come from. And because your brain, during all time, whatever your age, is plastic and can change through learning, if you have the good educational leverage, basically, or levers, you can produce actually learning gain, and you produce learning gain because you have neuroplasticity. With no neuroplasticity, you couldn't compensate for non-optimal environment during the first years of life. Okay, so this COVID also affected children's well-being. Those are data from USA from a larger sample of 9,000 parents. Here, basically, normal level of prosocial abilities or peer problems are depicted in dark blue. So what we are interested, whatever is on the right side of each of those bar charts. And as you can see, 20% of the kids has very high prosocial issues, 9.5% peer problems, 6.8% hyperactivity problems, 4% conduct problems, 4.6 emotional problems. And so if you aggregate all this difficulty score, you aggregate over 10% of the kids after COVID who had like an increase in all this type of problems. So we know that COVID has an effect not only on academic achievement, but also on well-being. And so the key here is, where do we put, on which abilities we should like try to have an impact on? Should we just focus on literacy and numeracy as usual, or should we focus on other type of abilities? So that's the key questions, basically. If you want to address the COVID crisis and what it produced on learning, should you just focus on literacy and numeracy, or should you focus on other type of abilities? Okay, so it's not only for children, it's also for adolescents. This is a study done in Netherlands where they show that depending of your socioeconomic basically status, you have like effects on negative mood, but actually it is mediated or explained by the effect that when you come from low SES, you have more future uncertainty, and because you have more future uncertainty, this will have an effect on increased negative mood, basically. And this is mediated by other factors, more domain general factors that are involved not only in emotional regulation, but also in cognitive regulation that we call executive functions. So those are all the functions that are hosted in your prefrontal cortex and that will regulate all the cognitive and emotional processes in your brain. So again, if this is mediating or explaining part of the relationship between socioeconomic status, negative mood, and future uncertainty, those might be the type of abilities we want to foster in children in order to compensate for the effect of the COVID crisis and more generally of the learning crisis. Okay, so we actually know that for a long time. This is not new whatsoever. If you look at the predictors of educational achievement, which is actually what we are interested in, we are not interested by academic achievement. We don't want to know whether you will succeed at school. We want to know whether you will succeed in life. So the type of predictors we should be interested in are basically the predictors of your educational attainment. And educational attainment should be about well-being, should be about mental health, physical health, and maybe your level of happiness. So if you look at this, you can basically contrast different type of predictors. We can look at 3 types of predictors. So that's a study done in the US where they contrasted the socioeconomic status of the family the children were coming from. They measure IQ during childhood, but they also measure something a bit like ODD, which is basically self-control. Self-control is your ability to control your impulsivity. And so they measure these 3 types of variables in those kids, and then they follow longitudinally these kids from 4 years old all the way to adulthood. And then they ask the questions, what produce individual differences in adulthood in terms of mental health, physical health, and well-being? Is it more variation in IQ, or is it more variation in the social SES, basically, levels of the family, or the self-control abilities? Well, interestingly, what actually explains the least your educational achievement is IQ, which is strange because all our educational systems are driven toward fostering cognitive abilities in students. But if this is not the best predictor of what you will become as an adult, then we need to foster other type of abilities. And so, well, of course, most of the variance or the variability of your educational achievement is related to the socioeconomic status of your family. This is like kind of expected. This is showing that our educational system are not working the way they should. But it also showed that actually in this study, even when you control for the variability explained by IQ and the social economic status, what predict more your educational achievement is self-control. And self-control is basically one of the social emotional skills. So what we should be actually fostering in the kids at the moment is probably self-control. So how can we do that? I'm just going to show you a bit of the studies we're running in the lab where we felt, okay, we know that there is an issue in education is that tends to not be evidence-based education. And usually teachers have a hard time to understand why we use some kind of randomized control trials, why we use the experimental method, what it is important to have like basically a professional or to have like pedagogy informed by evidence. So our idea was to say, well, let's have the teachers be experimentators in the classroom. But in order to do that, let's explain what and why we use the experimental method. So we had like this long first part of the study was basically building momentum to do this participatory research. We explained why we needed a control group, why we need a pre-test and a post-test when we do this type of studies. And then we worked on whether we can use like basically simple games to foster self-control in the classroom and out of the classroom, but providing evidence that actually it works. So we asked the teachers basically to collect data on a very classical task that is tapping into a bit of the self-control and more generally cognitive control. And then we ask half of the students within each of the class to play some games that actually tap into self-control and cognitive control, such as red light, green light, Wesley Says, and a bunch of different board games, basically. And they play it 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week, for 6 weeks. And the other students in the same classroom are playing different type of games that train different type of executive functions, basically. And then we retest all the groups after 5 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks, and we use this online platform to do that. So we're not directly going into the schools. We're using this platform. This platform allows us to do participatory online research. Okay, so if you just look at the right part of the screens, so the control group is in blue, the experimental group is in purple, well, violet, I don't know how you call that. Sorry, this is like where my English lack, basically. And so pretest is on the left, post-test is on the right, and as you can see, the experimental group actually progressed more than the control group. So that provides evidence that you can use games to foster self-control, and that could have actually positive effect on the abilities of the children when the teachers in their own classroom collect the data, do the intervention, so forth and so on. So there are some limitations, but still you provide kind of evidence that are based on the experimental method. So just to show you that we can do like a lot of those type of studies to also empower teachers to have like a more kind of reflection on the type of pedagogy they're using in their classroom. And so we are very interested in my lab at the moment on the issue of basically media truth discernment. So we're all talking about the fact that fake news is probably one of the biggest threats for health. World Health Organization are actually stating that the first and the biggest threat for health across the world is the diffusion of fake news. So the question was whether what we're using as a pedagogy in the classroom at the moment is actually working to improve media truth discernment. So same thing, we use this platform, we say to the teacher, this is what we're interested in, let's co-construct everything together. We co-constructed how to pre-test media truth discernment, how to post-test media truth discernment, and we also worked with them on basically giving them, the intervention was co-constructed with them. So that was the first group of teachers. And then we ran the RCTs with the second group of teachers, okay? So what we are interested in is to contrast basically classical education we're doing on media truth discernment is media literacy, and we contrasted that with media literacy plus some kind of metacognitive kind of approach where we explain that, well, when we judge an information, it's just not about the source of information, not about the content, but it's also about the way we receive this information. We have confirmation biases, we have a lot of different type of biases that will also make it difficult for us to judge the veracity of the information. Okay, and then we looked at what it produced for real news and fake news. So we asked for each of those news to rate on a scale from 1 to 4 how much you think that this news is true or false. Very simple. So the higher, the most you think that this news is true. So let's start with the right part, actually, of this graph, because that's the one where it's kind of expected what we found. So fake news, what we found, pretest is in blue, gray is post-test. When you look at the right part of it is media literacy, so classical intervention, you find no effect whatsoever. It goes a bit down, but if you run statistical analysis, it's actually non-significant. The only thing that seems to work for detecting fake news, so having a low rating after intervention, is the one where you make the students aware of their own biases when they judge the information, you don't talk just about the source of the information and so forth and so on. The worrisome is on the left part. When you do like classical media literacy, it actually makes the students skeptical about any kind of news, including real news. And this is really worrisome because the more skeptical you are about the news, the more prone you are to accept basically conspiracy theory. So what we have in our education system is basically a pedagogy that is producing negative outcome. So this is why we actually do need evidence-based education, is that sometimes we are thinking we're making the best for the students, but we're producing negative outcomes. So this is the case in France. Maybe it's only France. So we're trying to replicate that in other countries, because this is very important to see whether it's specific to one country or whether it's true for all countries. Because it's also a way to improve our educational system. We know education is very cultural. So, and we know that comparative education researcher has been saying it's all context-based. Okay, but well, let's test that. Let's do like hard experimental method to try to test what is context, what is not context, basically. So we try a bunch of things along metacognition to reduce educational inequalities also. So we're going to very low SES neighborhood in Paris. And I'm just not going to show you what we produce in terms of intervention, but just to show you why it is important not just be stuck about like basically literacy and numeracy. What we found was that basically, it's the left part you should look into, seems to be complicated, but it's very simple. SES, we look at the direct effect of SES on math or direct effect of SES on language. And as expected, even in preschoolers, before they enter primary school, you find huge inequalities in language and math due to SES. But actually what we found was that all this inequality in language and math was actually explained by the effect of SES on metacognition. So again, it speaks to the idea that if you have inequalities in math and language, it's not enough to do more math or more language. What you should actually try to improve in your students before they start to read or to count is actually metacognition, is teaching the fundamental of learning. It's a bit of a weird word we are into. So we are actually teaching in a kind of double-blind context. The teachers know nothing about the brain of the students know nothing about their brain. This is like completely crazy if you think of it. I mean, the best way to learn is to know how to learn. The best way to teach is to know how the students learn. So we really need to move forward into this idea, and this is what we're testing. We probably have the data in a year from now. Okay, why do we need evidence-based education? Well, I'm going to tell you the tale of, so it's not the toy, it's actually the tale of Scratch for math education. So Scratch has been used a lot to actually teach math because programming skills could be a bit similar to the resolution of problems. And this is a study that's just been published in France. Again, we should see whether you have the same type of effect in other countries. Okay, but what they found was that actually Scratch has a negative outcome on all different type of mathematical abilities. Again, negative outcome. The key here, and the most interesting part of this study, is if you ask the teachers, they all thought that using Scratch will actually improve mathematical abilities of their students. So again, this is why we need evidence-based education. We need to assess what actually we produce in terms of learning gains, irrespective of whether it's math, social emotional skills, because sometimes we're misled. When we use a new tools, we think it will have positive outcome. It might not, so we need those type of data. Okay, so why do we need evidence-based education supported by international research projects? Well, there's kind of a weird thing happening here. If you look at the number of scientists per million, it's basically they're all in the global north. If you look at the quality of education tends to be like lower in the global south. So we have something that is not working here. We need to do more research in the global south to address the issue of the global south, not more research in the global north to say what we should do in the global south. That makes no sense, basically. So, and I'm going to close on it because I'm already out of time. And I'm going to plea for an international research agenda. So basically, we know that health and environmental crisis reveals the many vulnerabilities of our education system and call for an urgent response from our educational system. The learning crisis shouldn't be viewed as one affecting academic learning, such as numeracy and literacy, but the fundamental of learning, so basically the cognitive and social emotional process involved in learning. Most of the science of learning research is conducted in the global north, while critical issues to address emerge in the global south. So we need an international interdisciplinary research agenda to evaluate precisely and objectively, and that's, I think, the key, what works where. Thanks a lot.
Hi, my name is Joyce. I'm from Trinity College London. It was really fascinating to see the research study, because a lot of times you assume certain things, that you are making a positive impact, but you could actually be making a negative impact. I think one of the challenges with CEL is how do you measure? And you were saying, what are we testing for? We want to improve cognitive and social emotional skills, but how do you test it? And how do you know that you're testing and measuring the right things?
Well, I think you asking the right questions. The issue with social emotional learning and social emotional skills is how you measure them. We tend to have essentially like subjective assessment at the moment. So you either ask the students, how do you feel? Or you ask the teachers to reflect on how their students feel. So we really do need to put like a research agenda where we actually try to come out with better assessment. It could be like numerical traces, and that's, I know MGIP is trying to do such things. I also think that we need to think a bit more also the definition of these different social emotional skills, how we can try to do that. We're building a game at the moment for actually the French government, where we try to assess different type of social emotional skills by combining basically in those mini games in order to create measure that could be reflecting of, for instance, empathy, adaptability, and those type of skills. So I do think that that's the first step of the agenda. How do we have like better measure? Then how we can track through times how social emotional skills evolved, and then ask the question of which type of intervention works best where. And again, the where is key here. Like, it might not work similarly in all different countries, but we don't know that. Usually we do some studies and we think that it will be like pertinent in another context, and I think we should be shying away from this type of generalization. I do think there is a lot of things that are general in learning. I mean, again, don't take me wrong here. I do think that people look at the trajectory of development and the trajectory of learning and look at the heterogeneity of this trajectory, and this is perfectly normal. But again, like usually the image I take is to say all tides are different, but are actually under the effect of the same physical principle. And it's exactly the same thing for learning and for development. So the key is to find the mechanisms, and once we identify those mechanisms, try to find how do we adapt to the culture in a way that it actually produces positive outcomes.
I'm Krishan Gupta. My concern is about the well-being. What are the dimensions of well-being you have considered?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, well-being is a very complex, basically, construct. So again, I think from study to study, well-being is assessed in a different way, and it's also different depending on the culture you're looking at, how you define well-being. So well-being could be like different variables that are related also to different type of contexts. So at the moment, we are interested in well-being at school, because I don't think it's the same type of well-being that you can experience when you're at home or where you are in different contexts. So irrespective of the issues of what is the construct by itself and how you define it, I also think you need to assess well-being in different contexts, because again, you have students that express a lot of well-being outside of the classroom, and when they are in the classroom, they expect a lack of well-being, and that actually is predicting of their school achievement. So we should also be very mindful of that. Okay. This is going to be the disruptive one.
Following up on that,
yeah.
The idea here of well-being is always a very contentious one, as you already alerted in terms of its definitions. Now, what we have done in economics, and I'm wondering whether we could do something in education, is that forever there's been these definitions of well-being, and there's different schools of thought, and they never come together at the same time. And some of the pioneering work from Ken Arrow and Das Gupta is to sort of say, looking at well-being, however you define, is to establish a set of competencies that are essential for pursuing well-being, irrespective of how you define it.
Yeah.
And in economics, they were very smart, in a very smart way, kind of did a sort of an equivalence theorem approach, and sort of saying that the state of capitals that they have, because that's the productive base, will be essential for well-being. So if you have anything that decreases, then your well-being has gone. But they don't define that. And I'm wondering whether we could actually reduce these to competencies. And this is why numeracy and literacy has always been so popular, is because it's a competency and they can measure it.
True.
But I'm wondering whether you can have a larger vector of competencies, and you have already alluded to that. So what's the challenge in measuring those?
No, I think what you're proposing is probably the good way to go. Is if we stay at the level of this very large construct that is well-being, I think we're not going to make it and to be able basically to propose like objective measure of it. So we need to measure a number of different type of competencies that make sense and that are related to well-being. And then again, I think well-being, and those might not be the same competencies depending of the context in which you look at well-being, and then you see whether you can combine those in a way to extract what is well-being, basically, based on this large scale and this large number of competencies. But I agree. I mean, the question is the right level at which you measure those competencies. If you go really low level, you might not capture what is well-being, and if you go too high, there is no way of measuring it. So it's basically a trade-off. That's exactly what we're trying to do with the mini-games we are developing to measure like adaptability and the other type of social-emotional abilities. Yeah.
Sir, I'm Neha Nain. I'm research scholar. I need to ask you which scale you had used to measure social and emotional abilities.
We didn't assess social emotional abilities, but like in the study I showed,
Yes,
that was
sir.
predictive basically of your educational achievement.
Okay.
That's the one you're referring to?
Yes, sir. You had also mentioned one model over here.
Yeah.
Which model was that?
Well, the study I was referring to was like a study in which they measure basically social emotional skills and in terms of self-control based on questionnaires filled by the parents, basically.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot.